The day Karen towed my tractor was the day the gloves came off, metaphorically speaking. Literally, I was wearing leather work gloves, because I'd just finished fencing a paddock on the backside of my acreage. I wasn't expecting a war. I was expecting a cold drink, a shower, and maybe a grilled cheese. Instead, I pulled into my driveway to find a bootleg towing company winching my John Deere onto a flatbed like it was some clunker in a Walmart parking lot. I hadn't even taken the keys out of the ignition before I saw her, Karen, HOA president, certified menace, and self-declared guardian of neighborhood aesthetics, standing across the street with her arms folded like a smug gargoyle wearing oversized sunglasses. To be clear, I live on a 5-acre ranch that technically falls within the Oak Haven Community Zone, which is a fancy way of saying the HOA had crept its way out here from suburbia like some invasive vine choking the life out of rural peace. My land predated the development by about 40 years. My grandfather's name is still on the original deed, etched in cursive and framed above my fireplace. But Karen didn't care. Karen had a newsletter and a clipboard, which in her world meant power. Now, she wasn't technically allowed to enforce most HOA rules on my property. We'd had this discussion before, twice in fact. She tried to slap me with a fine last year because my barn door was not in accordance with colonial color palettes. I ignored it. She escalated to a letter. I responded with a notarized exemption. She went quiet. I thought she'd gotten the message. Apparently, she'd just been lying in wait. According to the greasy 20-something operating the tow truck, Karen had submitted an urgent violation claim, stating that my tractor constituted industrial machinery abandonment and posed a visual nuisance to the community. The fact that it was parked in my own driveway, on my own gravel, with its own shade tree and birdsong accompaniment, didn't matter to her. She'd signed the order herself, which, by the way, isn't how any of that works. I walked over to her calmly, as I always do. Karen thrives on conflict, so I never give her what she wants. I just looked at her and said, "I hope you have good insurance." She squinted behind her sunglasses. "You can't leave that thing out front, Nate. It's against regulations. We're trying to maintain a certain standard here." I looked at the dirt under my boot. "You mean the standard where you make up rules and hope no one sues?" She smirked, and for a moment I could tell she thought she'd won something. I didn't argue further. No shouting. No threats. I just turned and walked back inside, which unsettled her more than anything else I could have said. What she didn't know is that I'd been keeping tabs on the HOA's antics for months. I knew about the fraudulent sprinkler fines. I knew about the time she tried to evict a retired couple over a non-compliant mailbox. I knew she'd overstepped with the Johnsons when she tried to repossess their chicken coop. I had screenshots. I had old bylaws. And now, she'd taken the bait without even realizing it. The tractor wasn't even mine, not technically. It belonged to my LLC, which made the seizure an unlawful interference in business property. And since it was towed from land outside the HOA's actual jurisdiction, it opened her up to personal liability. But I didn't tell her that. Not yet. I let her waltz back to her Mercedes with her clipboard of lies while I started making calls. The first was to the sheriff. I filed a report for property theft and presented my deed line. The second was to my cousin, who's an agricultural attorney in the next county over. And the third was to a former HOA board member who resigned after Karen tried to ban front porch swings. His words, "Oh, I've been waiting for someone to take her down." Over the next few days, Karen strutted through the neighborhood like a triumphant Caesar. She printed my violation in the HOA newsletter with the headline, "Action Taken Against Non-Compliant Machinery." I'll admit I laughed out loud. She actually used clip art of a tractor with a red X over it. But her victory lap didn't last. A week later, she got served. First with a notice of pending litigation, then a cease and desist order barring her from initiating further enforcement actions on my property. I made sure the courier wore cowboy boot. A little personal touch. Karen responded the only way Karen knows how, by escalating. The next day, I found a fresh violation taped to my barn door for unauthorized fencing materials. That was the moment I decided it was time to stop playing defense. If Karen wanted a war, I'd give her one, but it would be on paper, in courtrooms, and at public meetings, where she couldn't twist the truth without consequences. I'd grown up with cattle and coyotes. I knew how to wait. I knew how to strike when the moment was right. And I knew something Karen didn't. This wasn't about a tractor anymore. It was about power, and she'd just handed me the ammunition. The day after Karen received the cease and desist, she decided to retaliate in the most absurd way possible, by organizing what she called a HOA standards compliance walk. That's HOA speak for a group of clipboard-wielding busybodies pacing the streets pretending to care about the color of your shutters while secretly trying to catch you with your trash can out 15 minutes early. Naturally, she strutted around like General Patton leading troops into battle, her heels clicking dramatically against the concrete, flanked by two of her minions who looked like they'd been bribed with carrot cake and HOA gossip. They walked right past my driveway with exaggerated disdain, all pausing dramatically to squint at where my tractor used to sit, as if expecting it to rise from the gravel like a ghost and offend their sensibilities all over again. Of course, Karen made sure to point at my fencing and jot something down with theatrical flair. I leaned against my porch railing with a mug of coffee in hand and called out, "Y'all want to measure the cows too, or just the fence today?" She didn't respond, but her jaw tightened like she'd bitten into a lemon. That night, I found a new violation notice taped, no, nailed, to my oak tree. She was trying to charge me a daily fine of $100 for unauthorized fencing materials, non-standard coloration, and lack of pre-approved landscaping. For context, the fence in question was a cedar split rail I'd installed myself 3 years earlier. The stain was natural. The materials were sourced from my own property. And landscaping? I had wildflowers, not petunias from aisle 7 of a big-box garden center. But she didn't care. Her fines were fake currency in a kingdom of make-believe authority, but to the average resident, they felt real and expensive. I didn't respond. Not directly. Instead, I documented every action she took. I started a digital folder titled Karen's Greatest Hits and filled it with dated photos, scanned letters, bylaw excerpts, and testimony from neighbors who'd also been harassed. I even installed a wildlife camera aimed at my driveway, which caught one of her minions trying to take photos of my property from a stepstool. That became Exhibit 12, Peeping Tom with Clipboard. Meanwhile, my cousin Ellie, the AG law attorney, was working with me to build a civil claim. She'd already confirmed that my property had been grandfathered in with a clause that essentially nullified most HOA rules. Even better, the HOA had failed to update their jurisdictional maps with the county when they annexed nearby parcels. Which meant Karen wasn't just wrong, she was out of bounds. Literally. Ellie also noticed something strange in the violation documents Karen had mailed. The board meeting dates listed on the forms didn't line up with the HOA's official record. That led us to dig into their bylaws and realize Karen had been forging approval for unilateral decisions. She hadn't gotten a single board vote for my fines, the towing order, or even the new standards compliance walk. It was all theater, dramatics on official-looking paper. I decided to bring in backup. Remember the ex-board member I mentioned? Name's Tom. Retired Army, lives a few houses down, keeps his lawn at regulation height only out of spite. He quit the board after Karen tried to ban holiday inflatables, citing seasonal clutter. I invited him over for coffee and laid out everything I'd found. He laughed so hard at the Peeping Tom photo he almost dropped his donut. Tom was furious but also thrilled. He offered to be a witness and provide documentation of prior board discussions where Karen had bulldozed through protocol. More importantly, he told me Karen had been bragging at a neighborhood mixer that, if I don't like it, I write a violation and the sheep follow. I wrote that down word for word. It would look great in court. But before we got there, Karen decided to raise the stake. One morning, I found 2 more notices. One for excessive dust due to unpaved driveway, and another for uncontained livestock sounds. That's right. She tried to fine me because my rooster was too loud. In a rural area. On a legal ranch. It wasn't even creative anymore. It was desperation. Karen knew something was coming. Word had spread that I was working with legal counsel. I'd heard from the Johnsons, the couple she threatened over their chicken coop. I'd heard from 3 other families who had paid HOA fines they now suspected were fake. They sent me scans of their notices. Same signature. Same forged approval. So I compiled it all. Ellie filed the paperwork for a lawsuit against both the HOA and Karen personally, citing unlawful property seizure, harassment, defamation, and abuse of power. We even had a fraud investigator look at the timestamps on her documents and confirm they were altered. It was airtight, and I hadn't even played my trump card yet. See, my land wasn't just exempt from HOA landscaping rules. It had a unique easement clause from the 1970s. The HOA's private road ran partially across a strip of my property. That meant their entire front entrance, signage, hedges, decorative rock walls, was on land I technically owned. They'd never paid rent. They'd never asked permission. And they'd parked a community mailbox station right on my soil. I wasn't planning to be cruel. Just fair. So I had my lawyer draft a lease agreement with backdated rental costs. Nothing unreasonable, just 20 years of unpaid use, interest adjusted. It totaled over $67,000. I mailed it to the HOA's official address and copied Karen directly. She didn't respond in writing. She showed up in person. It was a Thursday morning. I was unloading hay when I saw her Mercedes roll up my gravel drive like it had never seen unpaved earth. She stepped out in heels, on a ranch, and immediately sank into the dirt. Watching her struggle to free her shoe while maintaining whatever dignity she had left was almost poetic. I offered her a hand, which she ignored. "You're bluffing," she said, red-faced and panting. "You can't charge us for that land." "I can. I am. And I will," I said. "Unless you want to renegotiate terms for usage. Or we can settle it all in court." She sputtered something about legal counsel and stormed off. A rooster crowed in the background. I swear, he timed it just for her. That night, the HOA Facebook group exploded. Someone had leaked the lawsuit. Residents were furious. The Johnsons posted their fine with the caption, "Anyone else got fake HOA bills? Post 'em here." Within hours, the thread had 40 screenshots and counting. Karen tried to delete the thread. Then she shut the group down altogether. But it was too late. Pandora's box was wide open, and her grip on the neighborhood was slipping fast. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that the court date was approaching. And the judge overseeing the case had grown up in a farming family just 1 county over. We weren't walking into a courtroom with some clueless urbanite. We were walking in with someone who understood that a tractor is not an eyesore. It's a lifeline. And Karen had towed mine without cause. The storm hadn't hit yet, but the clouds were gathering. And soon, she'd be the one watching her property roll away on a flatbed. Court day arrived with the kind of quiet tension that makes even the most seasoned rancher check his watch 3 times in 5 minutes. I pulled up in my old pickup, boots freshly scrubbed, and a folder full of exhibits riding shotgun. Karen, on the other hand, arrived in her usual spectacle, designer sunglasses, a power walk like she was heading into a Vogue photo shoot instead of civil litigation, and that familiar air of haughty entitlement. She looked at me like I was some dirt clod under her Prada heels. I gave her a nod like she'd just walked into the corral and didn't realize the bull was already behind her. The courtroom was small, just a local civil court tucked beside the county building. Nothing fancy. 2 rows of pews, a seal above the bench, and Judge Hendricks presiding. Grizzled, gray-mustached, and visibly unimpressed with nonsense. I knew the second I saw his BOLO tie and cattle brand belt buckle that Karen was in trouble. She didn't notice. She was too busy powdering her nose and whispering to her lawyer, a wiry man who looked like he'd Googled how to sue a farmer 10 minutes before filing. We went first. My attorney Ellie, who'd swapped her boots for heels but still had hay dust in her pickup bed, opened with a calm, methodical summary of what had happened. The unauthorized towing of a tractor parked on private property, the forged HOA documentation, the repeated harassment through illegitimate fines, and the critical detail that my land was not, and never had been, under HOA enforcement jurisdiction. Her tone was precise, clipped, and devastating. She presented deeds, maps, and a notarized copy of the original zoning agreement showing my parcel's exemption. Then she moved to the more damning stuff. Timestamps altered on violation letters, board meeting minutes that never existed, and a half-dozen witness statements, Tom included, that confirmed Karen had been operating unilaterally, without board vote. Karen's lawyer stood and tried to object halfway through, citing proprietary HOA protocols. Judge Hendricks raised one eyebrow and said, "Son, do you know what proprietary means?" That was the end of that. Then came the piece de resistance. Ellie pulled out a printed photo, full color, blown up to 8 by 10. It showed my tractor midair, being hoisted by a tow truck, with Karen standing in the background looking like the villain in a made-for-TV drama. Next to it was a copy of the tow order, signed only by her, with no HOA board vote or authorization. She let the image linger as if it were a painting in a gallery. The judge took off his glasses, looked at Karen, and asked flatly, "Did you authorize this tow personally?" Karen straightened up. "As president of the HOA, I have full authority to enforce standards for the betterment of the community." That tractor was unsightly. Unsightly? Hendricks repeated slowly. "Yes," she said, clearly thinking she was nailing this. "It was rusted, loud, and disruptive to the visual harmony of Oak Haven. It was parked on his property." She blinked. "Yes, but visible from the road. That road being a private easement running over his land." "Technically, yes." He held up a hand. "Ma'am, do you realize that what you're describing is not a code violation, but trespass and property interference?" Karen tried to pivot. "This isn't about a tractor. It's about neighborhood standards. About keeping things orderly and—" He cut her off. "It's about whether or not you had the legal right to touch this man's equipment." Ellie coughed politely and added, "and whether she personally filed fraudulent notices and illegally levied financial penalties under HOA authority she did not possess." The silence in the room was glorious. Karen's defense fell apart after that. Her lawyer tried to argue that the HOA had an implied mandate, citing an obscure clause in the community charter about external appearances. Ellie countered that implied mandates don't override property deeds, legal exemptions, or due process. The judge agreed. Karen's expression soured by the second. In the end, Judge Hendricks ruled decisively in my favor. The HOA was barred from further action against my property. Karen was found personally liable for unlawful seizure and harassment, and she was ordered to pay damages, plus cover all towing and legal costs. Total amount? Just shy of $38,000. But I wasn't done yet. After the hearing, I filed an immediate lien on Karen's vehicle for non-payment. Her BMW, a sleek black model she polished every weekend like it was made of diamonds, was parked just off the easement strip in front of her house. That same easement that, thanks to that old zoning clause, was legally mine. We served the lien papers within 72 hours. When Karen opened her door to see the very same tow truck driver she had once called to remove my tractor, she nearly dropped her frappuccino. He smirked as he hooked her front tires. "Funny how life works, huh?" she screamed. Oh, she screamed. Loud enough that the neighbors peeked out. One started filming. Another clapped. She ran into the street barefoot, arms flailing, demanding to see the paperwork, as if that ever worked. The driver calmly handed her the lien order and pointed to the judge's signature. "Talk to Hendricks," he said. "I just follow court orders." I watched from my porch, sipping sweet tea like it was the last day of summer. Her BMW was lifted clean off the ground and towed off her own front lawn. For extra irony, the truck took the same route she'd forced mine to take weeks earlier. The best part? It wasn't just the car. With her legal defeat and the pending civil suit from other residents jumping in with their own claims, Karen's position as HOA president became untenable. An emergency meeting was called by Tom and 2 other board members. They used a little-known clause in the HOA charter allowing for a special vote to remove the president in cases of gross misconduct. Karen tried to shut it down. She called it a witch hunt and said, "I've given this neighborhood standards, order, pride." The neighbors replied with fine notices they'd been threatened with, photos of her peeking over fences, and screenshots of her forging documents. The vote wasn't even close. 82% voted to remove her. The rest abstained or didn't care. Karen was officially dethroned. Stripped of her title, she stormed out of the meeting and hasn't attended one since. Her minions resigned the next day. As for the BMW, she never got it back. The court allowed me to auction it off to recover part of the damages she owed. I didn't want the car, just the justice. A local mechanic bought it at the auction and still drives it around town. Sometimes he honks when he passes my place. I wave back every time. It was never about revenge. Not really. It was about boundaries. Literal and legal. Karen thought she could bulldoze anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban paradise. But she forgot one thing: you don't mess with a rancher's land, his tools, or his patience. Because when we fight, we don't shout. We prepare. We collect. And when the trap is ready, we let them walk into it all by themselves. After the BMW was hauled away like a defeated war chariot, Karen went radio silent for the first time since she'd declared herself monarch of Oak Haven. The newsletter stopped. The compliance walks ceased. Even the Facebook group, her digital kingdom of passive-aggressive policy reminders, was frozen in time. No updates, no fines, no pixelated stock images of flower beds with captions like "Be Better, Oak Haven." Just eerie quiet, like a haunted HOA. I thought that was the end of it. But Karen, bless her deluded soul, wasn't done yet. See, she still had one last card to play. Or so she thought. It started with an envelope. Not the usual HOA template. This one was embossed, gold-trimmed, and reeked of perfume. Inside was an invitation to a community unity rebuilding brunch, hosted by none other than Karen Wilcox, former HOA president and eternal steward of Oak Haven values. Yes, that was actually printed on the card. The event was to be held at her home. Catered. With speeches. Dress code, garden formal. Which, as far as I could tell, meant linen blouses and a healthy disregard for humility. At first, I laughed and set it aside. But then Tom called. "You going to the circus?" he asked, already chuckling. "You mean the brunch?" "She invited me to. Wants to reunify the community after administrative turbulence. Thinks she's trying to do damage control before the next hearing." Ah yes, the next hearing. Because Karen's legal troubles weren't finished. 3 other families had joined the civil claim against her personally. Forged fines. Unauthorized entries onto their properties. In one case, she'd threatened a disabled vet over unapproved ramp design. So yes, Karen was trying to change the narrative. I decided to attend. Not because I believed in reconciliation, but because I wanted to see what delusional spin she'd cooked up, and to remind her that no brunch could erase a court judgment. The event was peak Karen. White tablecloths on plastic rental tables. A podium, of course. She wore a sun hat that could double as a satellite dish and carried a clipboard like she couldn't physically exist without one. Her opening speech was a masterpiece of manipulation. "We've all had our disagreements," she said, voice honeyed and fake. "But this community is stronger when united under shared standard. I may have made bold choices, but they were always for the good of Oak Haven." The only thing more painful than her speech was the frozen smiles of the attendees. You could see it in their eyes. They were done. This wasn't admiration, it was morbid curiosity. She handed out pamphlets proposing a revised HOA code of respect, with bullet points like positive lawn messaging and noise mindfulness workshops. I nearly snorted into my coffee when I read Rooster-Free Mornings. After her speech, Karen did a lap, trying to shake hands and mend fences. When she approached me, I stood calmly. "Nathan," she said, "I hope you can see this as a fresh start." "Karen," I replied, "do you know what the best fertilizer for fresh starts is?" She blinked. "Excuse me." "Consequences." She stared, unsure whether to scowl or smile. I turned away before she decided. Let her chew on that. Now, as absurd as the brunch was, it marked a turning point, not because it worked, but because it failed so spectacularly. Neighbors left early. Nobody took a single pamphlet home. And later that night, someone anonymously posted a video of Karen's brunch speech with the caption, "Former HOA president tries to gaslight community with free muffins." It got over 200 comments. My favorite was from a guy 2 streets over. "I'd rather let a raccoon write the bylaws." The next day, the HOA held its first board meeting under new leadership. Karen wasn't allowed within 100 feet of the clubhouse due to the restraining order filed by the Johnsons after she tried to sneak into their backyard to check if their shed had been painted without permission. That case was still pending. Tom opened the meeting with a simple statement: "Oak Haven is a community, not a kingdom. And it's time we started acting like one." Then came the real cleanup. The new board voted to eliminate every standing fine issued under Karen's tenure. They refunded over $6,000 in bogus fees. They announced an audit of HOA finances, which uncovered that Karen had spent over $1,200 on decorative compliance signage from a boutique in Aspen. Apparently, those ugly green Lawn Pride signs were imported from Switzerland. Most importantly, they declared my property officially outside the HOA's jurisdiction. They even put it in writing, signed, notarized, and hand-delivered. It was glorious. I framed it and hung it right next to Grandpa's deed. But I wasn't quite finished. I used part of the settlement money from the court judgment to fund something I'd been meaning to do for years. A new driveway, fully paved and lined with native wildflowers. I hired local workers, gave them lemonade, and let the project run straight through the HOA's easement strip. That's when I made my final move. Remember that HOA sign at the front entrance? The one planted halfway into my land? The one with the faux brick base and faux welcoming slogan? I had it removed. Then I replaced it with a beautiful wooden archway that said, "Welcome to Oak Haven, respect the land or be removed." I didn't get HOA permission. I didn't need it. I owned the dirt it stood on. That's the thing Karen never understood. She built her power on paper, on policy, on illusion. But my power? Mine came from the soil, the law, and the long game. A week later, I got a letter in the mail. Not from Karen. From her husband. It was an apology. A genuine one. Said he hadn't known half of what she'd been doing. That the stress had gotten to her. That she'd been trying to control everything because she felt like her life was slipping out of her hands. That she never used to be like this before the HOA gave her a clipboard and a vote. I didn't know what to do with that letter. Part of me felt bad. Another part of me remembered her smug face as my tractor got hauled away like it was trash. I kept the letter. I didn't respond. Karen eventually sold her house. Rumor had it she moved 2 towns over, to a place without an HOA. She started a gardening blog, called The Orderly Bloom. I checked it once. The homepage had a photo of a perfectly trimmed hedge. I closed it immediately. Too much trauma. Oak Haven changed after that. The new board stopped acting like petty tyrants and started organizing actual community events. Potlucks, garden swaps, kids' art shows. People started talking again. Not about violations or hedge height, but about life. And me? I got a new tractor. Painted it red this time. Parked it right out front. Not because I needed to prove a point, but because I could. It started raining the morning Karen's house went up for sale. A slow, quiet drizzle that felt like the sky itself had finally exhaled. I stood on my porch, arms crossed, watching a real estate agent hammer in the "for sale" sign right next to where her HOA-compliant tulips had once stood like soldiers. They were wilted now, overwatered and abandoned, fitting, really. A poetic little metaphor she probably would have hated. The lawn was unkempt, her hedges overgrown, and her famously sterile porch had become a spider's summer condo. I couldn't help but smile. There was no dramatic farewell. Karen didn't wave goodbye, didn't offer parting words, didn't even post one final warning on the HOA bulletin board. She just disappeared, like a software update no one asked for. One day she was there, lurking behind sunglasses and bylaws. The next gone. Her BMW, what was left of it, had already been sold at auction, stripped of vanity plates and dignity. Her legacy? A compost pile of cancelled fines, revoked orders, and a community that realized it had been sleepwalking under the rule of a tyrant in a pantsuit. Tom stopped by that afternoon, carrying a six-pack and a grin wide enough to split a fence post. "She really did it," he said, handing me a cold one. "Karen finally quit the kingdom." I clinked bottles with him and nodded. "She didn't quit. She got exiled. There's a difference." He laughed so hard he nearly fell off the porch swing. "The neighborhood began to heal after she left. Slowly at first. Like a dog learning it doesn't need to flinch when someone raises a hand. People started leaving their trash cans out a little longer. Mailboxes became colorful. Gnomes reappeared. It was like someone lifted a lid off the pressure cooker and let real life flow back in. The new HOA board, now chaired by Tom, focused on actual community welfare instead of dictating mulch color. They hosted monthly barbecues. Kids played kickball in the cul-de-sacs without being lectured about grass wear. Even the previously terrified Mrs. Dubrowski started walking her cat again. But there was still a bit of cleanup left, literal and legal. For starters, the civil suit continued without Karen. Though she'd been removed from office, the damage she'd done still had to be sorted out. The court ruled that since she acted outside her authority, she was personally liable, not the HOA. More residents joined in, emboldened by the success of my case. In the end, 5 families were awarded damages ranging from $2,000 to $9,000 depending on the fines they'd paid and the harassment they'd endured. Karen never showed up for the final hearing. Her attorney withdrew. Her last known address was a P.O. box in a town called Marigold Bluff, which sounded made up, but apparently existed. The HOA formally amended its charter too, including a clause that required all board votes to be publicly documented and archived. They even added a policy that allowed residents to appeal any fine within 72 hours with no penalty, a tiny safeguard, but one that could have saved a lot of heartache if it had existed sooner. As for me, I kept to my usual rhythm: feed the horses, check the fences, mow the fields, but something felt different. Like I wasn't under a microscope anymore. Like I could breathe deeper. One morning, while fixing a fence post near the front of my property, I noticed a minivan pull up. A young couple stepped out, fresh-faced, clearly suburban, but carrying clipboards and wearing matching realty polos. They introduced themselves as the new owners of Karen's old house. "We heard the neighborhood used to be kind of intense," the woman said cautiously. "Depends on what you mean by intense," I replied. "She means the HOA," her husband clarified. "We saw some articles online. Something about tractor wars and lawsuits." I grinned. "Ah, that. Don't worry. The storm passed." They both laughed nervously, clearly unsure if I was joking. As they drove off, I felt a strange mix of closure and curiosity. A new chapter had begun for Oak Haven. And maybe that meant a new chapter for me too. Later that month, Tom asked me to speak at the HOA's first annual Community Celebration Day. They wanted someone to give a speech on land stewardship, neighborliness, and rebuilding after conflict. I almost declined. But I remembered what it felt like, standing alone against a wall of fake authority, watching a stranger tow away your property while your voice was ignored. If telling that story helped someone else find their spine, it'd be worth it. So I agreed. On the day of the event, the entire neighborhood gathered in the park. Kids ran wild with face paint, couples mingled over lemonade, and someone even brought a mechanical bull. I watched it all with quiet amusement, waiting for my turn at the mic. When it came, I kept it simple. "I'm not a public speaker," I began. "I'm a rancher. I believe in fences, not walls. In neighbors, not overlords. And in tractors that stay where you park 'em." The crowd chuckled. "I've lived on this land since I could walk. Before there were cul-de-sacs, before the landscaping mandates, before the newsletters. I've seen this community grow. And I've seen what happens when fear dresses up as order." I paused, letting that sink in. We learned something this year. That rules are meant to serve people, not the other way around. That a neighborhood is built on kindness, not compliance. And that when someone tries to turn power into a weapon, the best defense is unity. They clapped. Some stood. I even saw Mrs. Dubrowski wiping her eyes. After the speech, someone handed me a community award. It was a little golden tractor mounted on a block of wood. The plaque read, "For unyielding resolve and lawn-based justice." I laughed until I cried. A few weeks later, I was in town when I saw something that made me stop cold. At a gas station just off the highway, parked near Pump 7, was a familiar figure. Sunglasses, blazer. The same posture I'd recognize anywhere. Karen. She was standing next to a rented SUV, pumping gas with a distant look in her eyes. No clipboard. No entourage. Just her. She hadn't noticed me. I stood there for a second, half tempted to walk over and say something. But then I remembered the way her voice sounded when she justified towing my tractor, like it was just a logical step in her little dictatorship. I remembered the look of smug certainty as she nailed fake violations to my fence. And I realized I didn't need to say anything. She already knew. I turned and walked away. Some ghosts are better left in the rearview mirror. Back home, the red tractor sat gleaming in the sun. Wildflowers swayed along the edge of my new paved drive. And just beyond the archway, the whole of Oak Haven breathed a little freer, lived a little louder, and laughed a little more. As for me, I never ran for HOA board. Never needed to. I'd already won. And every time I fire up that red tractor, I remember the lesson Karen taught us all. About power, about pride, and about what happens when someone forgets who really owns the land they're standing on. And let me tell you something. I don't forget.